So our next panel, which is being moderated by Jane Tabor, is called The Culture of Power in Politics, How to Get Things Done. It's a chance for us to look at how women have maneuvered within a difficult system, political system, to build consensus. And I'd like to invite Jane and our panelists for this next session to come up. So I'd like to ask Jean, Patty, Janet, and Marie to come up to the stage. And while we had a chance to hear from the Norway perspective, we also have some insights from the Kenyan perspective as well. We have an incredible book here, a memoir of Flora Igoki Tera, who spoke earlier this morning. Copies of this book are available for sale. It's about her journey and really remarkable story, which is available on sale out by the registration. And proceeds from the book go to support Flora's time while she's here in Canada.
Very much. Well, welcome to the 1:30 panel, and this is the culture of power and politics. And this is all about how to get things done. So I'm interested in hearing about this too, because sometimes I have a lot of trouble getting things done. First of all, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Jane Tabor. I'm the senior political writer at the Globe and Mail. Thank you. Oh, this is way better than Parliament. I'm also the co-host of CTV's Question Period. And I've been covering the Hill since 1986, so I've seen a lot of changes, and I've seen a lot of women trying to maneuver themselves through what is a really sort of testosterone-laden atmosphere, and I think it's still that way today. So without further ado, just let me introduce the panel. I'll give some brief introductions. Janet Eckert is to my right, and of course you'll remember her as a former finance minister, a very non-traditional role for a woman. And now Janet is the, let me get this right, the Toronto Financial Services Alliance. She's the president of that, and of course involved in the discussions over the merger of the TSX, which is quite interesting, but that's another day probably. To Janet's right is Patty DuCharme. She's the Vice President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. Again, another job that doesn't usually go to females. So it'll be interesting to see how sharp your elbows are. And to Patty's right, of course, is the Honourable Jean Augustine. And Jean is a former Member of Parliament, and she is now the Ontario Fairness Commissioner, and Jean is someone who I covered on Parliament Hill, and I hope fairly. So maybe we'll find out about that today. So the way I wanted to start, okay, they're talking about me now. The way I wanted to start with these three women. Oh, sorry, Marie Wilson is here. You know what? Let me move. Because we don't want to, I was wondering why you were signaling to me. And of course, Marie Wilson is the Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So thank you very much for joining us. And I'm sorry that I didn't notice you right away. This is about sort of the challenges that women face in environments that are usually traditionally dominated by male. And so instead of hearing first about the challenges, I want to hear about your wins. I want to hear about how you won, your victories, how you did it. And so we'll start with you, Marie. What was your most significant win in your job, and how did you make it happen?
Well, first of all, good morning to everyone. And may I just say, in the context of a women's conference, that I think it's cruel and unusual punishment not to have a 2-minute bio break after a keynote speaker. So I apologize for being a couple of minutes late getting to the stage. I want to offer my comments in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And I would say that my breakthrough was not mine at all. It was really the breakthrough of the very courageous Aboriginal peoples of Canada who decided to come forward in what became the biggest class action lawsuit in Canadian history to take on the formidable forces of the federal government and 4 national churches, and to lead to the creation of an unprecedented historic opportunity in Canada, the creation of the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission of its type in the was ever designed because of harms that had been done to little children, and to little children of a particular ethnicity, and not over a few years of a battle or a war, but over decades and centuries of removal from family, language, culture, and placement far from home often for months or years at a time, where these children were very often, far too often as we've learned over the past year and a half of our commission's work, were in harm's way by virtue of the fact that they were out of sight, out of mind, and often supervised or cared for in ways that were substandard by any of today's standards. So, as I say, to go back to your question, my breakthrough was not mine. What I think will be the breakthrough that we are aiming for, myself as one of 3 commissioners, is that as a result of our work and our 5-year mandate as a commission, that we will have somehow broken through the collective amnesia of our country and the massive ignorance that we have had as a nation about this part of our Canadian history, which is not actually a chapter of our history. It's actually a ribbon that runs right through our entire history that somehow we manage not to learn about in our schools, not to know about, and to marginalize as being an Aboriginal issue. Our breakthrough will be, and some touched on it this morning in the context of women's issues, will be when it is understood to be a Canadian issue. This is a Canadian issue. It is history that was put in place at that time by a totally male-dominated political system, certainly not represented by any Aboriginal people, and we're living with consequences today that are in the midst of all of us and belong to all of us. We have a wonderful opportunity through the courage of everyone to reframe Canada and to learn from this and to decide how we want to live out our partnership in keeping with the spirit of the Constitution, which says we have 3 founding peoples.
Thank you very much. Janet Ecker, your biggest win politically in your career?
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me say congratulations to Equal Voice for a 10th anniversary. I think, what? It's not on. I had to turn it on. Congratulations to Equal Voice for celebrating a 10th anniversary. I think some of the folks who were around the table 10 years ago don't think they might have predicted that not only would we all be here 10 years from now with a truly national, bipartisan, multi-partisan organization, but the other point that certainly hit me when I came in this afternoon, I was mentioning it to Donna, is I hardly know anybody in the room. And that's wonderful. That is absolutely wonderful. So we've got new, fresh individuals who are interested in our political process. And the second thing is that it's so wonderful to see so many of you who are so much younger than I am. So if any of us up here use references that you don't understand, please put your hand up and we'll try to explain it to you. But again, I can't think of another more positive thing for Equal Voice than to have new, fresh, young individuals who are interested in jumping into the political arena, because that's what it's all about. There's a couple of things I could mention, but I was the outside of politics, because I think as we're talking about how you make change and get things to happen, both in politics and outside politics, because I think it's equally important. I was director of policy at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which is the doctors' regulatory body in Ontario, at a time when we were able to not only discover but to try and address the problem of sexual abuse of patients by physicians. Very similar challenges to in a different way, but in terms of getting brave people to come forward with stories, getting an institution, an organization, a whole system that was very resistant to even admitting that there was an issue, to admit it and to deal with it. And we can talk, you know, as we all will, about how we've managed to do that, but we actually totally turned the organization and the whole regulatory structure on its ear in this space with some very, very good outcomes. I mean, obviously, problems still exist, no question, but it moved the needle significantly. The second thing I'd like to mention is that in Ontario, we have a new support program for people with disabilities who are forced to rely on government assistance for their livelihood or for their income. Because before, their only choice was to go on welfare. And welfare was a program that was not suited for people with disabilities who were likely going to need income support for the rest of their life. And that piece of legislation and the policies and the whole was new, it was different, and what was exciting about that is that we did it with multi-partisan support in the Ontario legislature. So those would be two I would mention, and when we get into some of the other lessons learned, would be quite happy to share. And it's very much my privilege also too to be up here with some very distinguished folks, and I'm very much interested in hearing them share with all of us their lessons as well today. So thank you, Jane.
Patty, let's hear from you.
Well, I have to say that when I became a trade unionist, I had been working for the federal government for probably 5 years. I'd been working in a very male-dominated work environment. I was actually a customs officer, now known as a border services officer. This is pre-guns. And I had the fortune of attending the very first National Women's Conference that the Public Service Alliance of Canada had for their members. Interestingly enough, at this National Women's Conference, probably a third to a half of the delegates were men, and the rest of them were women. And I can remember really being kind of confused about this and asking a fellow at my table why he was at the National Women's Conference, and he told me because he wanted to learn about women and women's issues. And I remember, now, you know, at this point, I can honestly say I was just a naive young woman, young worker. And I remember saying to him, "Don't you have any sisters or a mom or a wife or daughter that you can talk to about women's issues? Aren't there women in your local? Like, why are you here in the place of a woman?" So at that conference, I met a bunch of loudmouthed, angry feminists from Vancouver, BC. I'm a displaced West Coaster. And I'm happy to say that I wondered why they were so angry. You know, I was working in a unionized work environment. I felt I was an incredibly privileged young worker. And I started to learn from my sister, mentor, feminista friends, and soon realized that the feminist agenda, that women's issues, were not necessarily the trade union agenda, which was kind of mind-boggling for me. Equality for one, equality for all. And I got involved. I got very involved in our struggle for pay equity. And for those of you that are younger, my union, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, won a multi-billion-dollar discrimination case against the federal government of Canada for gender-based pay discrimination. It was a huge victory, and it was a victory that was won by our members, was won in the courts, but it was won in the court of public opinion. It was won in the streets by our members who mobilized, who got radical, who did all sorts of wild and crazy things, from occupying the minister responsible for status of women, to having hot dog sales where women paid 68. We did pay equity information sessions on airplanes where the government of the day, their caucus, their provincial caucus, was going to meet folks, and we were on the plane doing pay equity seminars with the full agreement of the flight attendants, who, needless to say, were fighting their own battle. So we won that case, which did cost over $3 billion to the government of Canada, to ensure, or to try to ensure, women's economic equality going into the future. That was a huge victory. That's the biggest victory I've been part of. It was a very sweet victory. Getting the human rights agenda and the feminist agenda on the books, not only in the union movement, but in any political entity, is a tough slog. And it's a slog where you recognize that individuals are powerful, but power comes from the collective, and we've got to build consensus in the collective so that actions that support the needed changes actually take place. We've seen erosion of our rights since that huge win, and I have to say we still have one case, our case against Canada Post, that's 27 years old. And I'm hoping, as the National Executive Vice President, that I'm still in office when we get to celebrate our victory against Canada Post.
Thank you very much, Patty. Jean.
Well, I'm so very pleased to be on this panel with individuals whom I have admired and who over the years I have watched the work that they've been doing. At the same time, I want to congratulate Equal Voice, because the face of this room and the look of this room is really what back in the early 90s I was hoping would be the look and the face of individuals who want to get into politics. When I decided, or when I was talked into, approached by all three parties to run, I had no role models. I had no mentors, no one who would say this is the way you do it. And I found that there was a culture of bravado in terms of politics. And this is the way you do things, this is how you look, this is how you whatever. And I was determined that I was who I was. I felt that I had been a successful educator and I had done some really good activism over a whole lot of stuff, and no one was going to change me because I was now getting into the political arena. So I continued to wear my scarves. I continue to look the way that I've always looked as an educator and as someone in the marketplace. I did things that were uncomfortable. Knew who my opponents were. I called them and asked them to sit and have a coffee. And I made it quite clear that my politics and whatnot was not going to be antagonistic and dirty, but that I hope that when we sit in any kind of debates, that it will be issues rather than personalities. That was not the way in which the party people around me gave me the kind of advice that they felt I should have, and I had to push to be myself, do what was comfortable with me, what was comfortable and what I felt that would make a difference for me. I spoke the unspeakable. I said things like, when I go out canvassing, I don't want I want to see everybody around me. So it's not just black folks walking down the street with me, but I want to see men and women and all the diverse people who live in this riding. I also spoke to the situation of my private life. I felt that I was my personal life was mine, and I didn't want to see it play out, and so I answered any questions that you or others asked. I did not answer questions that pertain to information about my children or my ex-spouse or any of that. I felt that I would keep my personal, that there were things that had to be out of bounds. And I said those very early. At the same time, I knew that there were challenges, and the big challenge was that as a black woman entering politics, as a black woman getting elected, the entire black population in Canada felt that they had sent me to Ottawa and that I was answerable to them. And they wrote me from prisons that they were in there and they needed to come out. They wrote me about profiling. They wrote me about all kinds of issues. But there were some nice letters in terms of the modeling. Every time you come, I see you walking with Chrétien. I call my grandchildren and I say, look, see, if you stay in school, you could be there. So I realized that there was some responsibility on my shoulders. I also knew that in my caucus, and there were members of my caucus who were here, that if I didn't get up and speak about issues that faced the diverse communities in Canada, Aboriginal people, people from all of the diverse groups, that there were other voices that would not bring the particular issue to the table. And so at times, at the same time, I had to temper that with trying to avoid the there she goes again, because if you keep bringing the issue up. So sometimes I voted with them on the sex life of the mosquito so that in turn they will support some other things that I would like to see happen. And the question again as to what you see as your accomplishment or what you see is, I think that the mere fact that this room and those individuals who are now putting themselves forward and saying, yes, we can do it, yes, we can move forward, is also an affirmation to others like myself and people on the panel who've gone ahead, who've broken some grounds, and who've made the way that others can say, if that individual can do it, I can do it.
Thank you very much, Jean. What surprises me about all these stories, and I know there's a lot of young people in the audience here, but it's not that long ago that these accomplishments were done. And just the fact that a woman getting into politics, but a woman of color in politics, to me, always surprised. It was 93, wasn't it, Jean, that you were elected? And to me, that really, for a lot of you people, is probably eons ago, but for me, it just doesn't seem that long ago, so it always surprises me. I want to talk about the challenges, and Marie, you spoke about how it was sort of a male-dominated bureaucracy that you were dealing with when it comes to Aboriginal people, Aboriginal rights, and what your issue was and what your struggle was. So talk a little bit about the challenge and how your gender played into this and perhaps changed things.
Well, I should say that I come from Yellowknife in Northwest Territories. That's where I live. And we heard this morning from one of a number of very powerful women who have been leaders for a long time in Northern Canada, including Nellie Cormier, who I think is going to be feted later on this evening as her many accomplishments, including Premier, and you heard from Nancy as well, Karatak Vimtal this morning. We have a different system of government there. We have a consensus system of government. It's not based on party politics. It's a very fascinating and not very well-known political lesson, living lesson that's unfolding in Canada, and it's a long ways from perfect. But it is a different model in some really fundamental aspects from how politics happens here in southern Canada and in other political jurisdictions. And so it forces, the reason I'm telling you that as context is it forces the ability to find consensus and to make consensus, otherwise you can't get anything done. One of the defining things about a consensus government system is that the cabinet is always perpetually in the minority. And I don't mean as in minority government, I mean as in square minority. There are far more ordinary members than there are members of cabinet. So you can't get anything done unless you've worked committees and tried to build consensus. So that's kind of the air that I have breathed professionally over the years. And as far as the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is concerned, the Commission's work itself is not a battle about men versus women, but the story in some ways is, because part of what was the price that was paid in the residential schools was the breakdown of family. If you think about where are our first models of leadership for so many of us, we would say our own mothers or our grandmothers. And I know for myself and probably for many in this room, my very first 24/7 full-time job was as a mother. The residential schools are about generations of kids who didn't have that bond with their parents and mothers who didn't get to play out that role. So the story of residential schools does have a really important chapter, which is about the price paid in terms of the early schools of leadership development and the early schools of bonding. And I'm moving a bit away from your question, Jane, respectfully. I hope you forgive me, but it's because I'm still thinking about what was talked about this morning. What are those things that make a difference in a person being able to move forward? And one of the things that was said was money, and yet we have, as part of the legacy of residential schools, the highest percentage of poverty in Canada is among Aboriginal people. One of the things that is really, really important is about a strong community. We have communities where kids were displaced and sent to different schools, even from their own siblings, and where the notion of community has been rocked, seriously rocked. And I'm not saying there isn't heroic work going on in many communities, but that is a legacy part of the story that we've been hearing about in our hearings over the past year and a half. One of the questions raised was the issue of confidence in oneself. And that isn't about a male or female thing. That's about generations of children who were told, your culture has no value, your language has no value, your parents are heathen and pagan savages. And so where does self-confidence take germ and grow in that kind of an environment when those are the messages that have been given? So, I'm just going through the checklist of the essential ingredients, and I'm thinking perhaps in the Aboriginal question, one of the biggest gender issues isn't really about an uphill battle on the issue of gender, but rather having equal voice in the context of the restrictions imposed by the Indian Act, which others far more knowledgeable than I spoke about this morning. But I want to be very clear that I myself am not an Aboriginal person. It happens, not just coincidentally, because I'm sure it's informed a lot of my sensitivity and my awareness. I'm married to an Aboriginal person, and I've been adopted into an Aboriginal nation for over 30 years now. But what I'm saying about this is because I think it's important that all of Canada realize that this is not a silo issue, just as the issue of women is, when women are left to stand alone, it can be a small voice. When society as a whole realizes that the issue of children, for example, and child raising and the inspirational things that we heard from our keynote speaker, that these things belong to all of society, then it stops those silos that pit people against each other and instead brings us to the issue of what is the value we believe in? What is the value? And I know many men in my life who have those deep values as well. So I think we have to find that and build consensus and go forward together.
You talk about money, let's talk to Janet then. You know about dealing with guys and money and politics. I want to hear about that because that is a role that has never, the finance minister federally has never been played by a woman. We've seen a few provincial finance ministers, but not one woman yet, and it's 2012. Or no, it's 2011. I'm ahead of myself.
Well, actually, I was always ambivalent about putting on the resume that I was the first woman in Ontario to actually deliver a budget, because I was embarrassed for the system. I mean, to me, it just seemed in 2002, we haven't had a woman in Ontario deliver a budget. For those of you who are trivia buffs, though, I was actually the second finance minister in Ontario. The first one was a wonderful woman by the name of Dr. Betty Stevenson, who actually broke a lot of barriers as a leader in medical leader, various organizations. But she was actually the first finance minister, but in a minority government, so it fell before she actually got to deliver the budget. So I like to acknowledge that because I think she and I sort of share something. A couple of things. First of all, we talk about male-dominated and testosterone on the Hill or in Queen's Park and the various legislatures and whatever, and all of that is true. But don't let it spook you. It's not an excuse. It's not does it cause problems? Does it put barriers in people's way? Of course it can. But it's not an excuse for anybody here in this room. Because anybody who runs for office, anybody who wants to get into politics, male, female, white, black, rich, poor, whatever, has problems and barriers. And it is indeed possible to get through them, to get over them. And one of the ways you do that is by building relationships within your networks, your friends, your business colleagues. You can't get anything done in politics without those relationships. You can never do it yourself. In minority government's a great example, right? A governments are supposed to have lots and lots of power, and they do. But in a minority house, they don't. So you need to have relationships. You need to be able to reach across the aisle in partisan politics. That is getting tougher and tougher in today's polarized culture in politics. But women do tend to be a little better at doing that. And so I think that's one thing that we can do. And the greatest accomplishments that I have as a legislator were all because of those kinds of relationships. Either I was able to get support of my cabinet colleagues on it. Sometimes you had to really work at getting the Premier's support for it, your caucus colleagues, members around across the legislature, stakeholders going out and stakeholders who maybe didn't like your government much. And some of us have had more experience with that than others. You need to get them on side, or them to help support and help you develop the kind of policies and whatever it is that you're trying to solve. So it's all about building those relationships and the kind of relationships that people are going to want to help you. And that's one of the things about politics. That's why tough nomination battles and all of that is really important, because you have to go out and get people to convince them to follow you, to go with you, to give you money, to knock on doors for you. So you may be the finance minister of a province, and there are more now than there used to be, and Jane's right, we haven't managed to get one in Ottawa yet. We're still trying to get a female politician to be there for a longer period of time, and we haven't managed to get that done yet. Kim was there for a while, but not that long. You still need those relationships, and finance ministers are the number 2 sort of political power in the government, but you still can't get what you want without that teamwork, without those relationships. The other message that I think is really, really important, and having Marie here talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the most important lessons when you're dealing with government, when you're asking government to do something for you, or whether you're in government, is the law of unintended consequences. And the second piece of that is the arrogance of today think. Because we all think, my God, what terrible people they were in government back then to do those terrible things to our Aboriginal community. Many of those people, in their time, thought they were doing the right thing. And were motivated by that. And here we are years later going, oh my God, how could that have happened? But there are all kinds of examples, thankfully not that dramatic, and without that kind of tremendous damage that was done. But every time government makes a decision or implements a policy, the 2 things you have to always remember is there will be an unintended consequence, and secondly, you may think you're right. But someday, like down the road, there are a lot of people making decisions in government today who think they're right. So you just kind of have to acknowledge that about your opponents, about people who made decisions before you, about people who are going to make decisions afterwards, and watch out for that. Belief in what you're doing is right, because that's important, but it can get you into a lot of trouble. So I think that's, for all of us, a very, very important lesson, I think, to carry into government, especially when you're a minister or a finance minister or a premier, prime minister, whatever, and you do have the ability to make change and make important, if you will, decisions to implement things and to change things.
Are you speaking from experience? Did something come back and bite you or something? I'm just wondering why you're talking about this lesson.
I guess because I saw it before I got into politics. I saw it when I was in politics. I used to say to people, be careful what you wish for, be careful what you ask. Do you really want government to do this for you? Let me use another example. People like to talk about the global financial meltdown that's happened, that almost brought our global financial system to its knees, quite literally, as being all because of greedy bankers on Wall Street. What frequently gets ignored is that it was government policy of both the left and the right side of the spectrum in the United States that said we want people in homes, from those who were the poverty activists, people who have fewer resources need to have a roof over their head. They need a home. Well-intentioned. The people who were on the right hand of the spectrum, if you will, were looking at it from if you are a property owner, you're a good, solid citizen, so we want more people to be property owners. They set rules that drove a whole series of sequence of things about lending money to people who had not a hope in heck of ever being able to pay it back. And it just became this kind of whirlwind cycle. So it was government policy that drove a lot of that. And again, a whole bunch of politicians, well motivated, and that's what happened. So there's just big issues and little issues. So it's an important lesson, I think, for all of us.
Okay, thank you. Patty, your challenges. I mean, you talk about a 27-year-old case that you still have that hasn't been solved. That's a big challenge. But other things that you come across your desk.
Just to pick up on the two previous speakers, I mean, building consensus is a critical part of the work I do, of what the union movement does to try to represent its members. It's not always easy. Finding people that you can actually collaborate with and identify issues that you can work on together, allies, is critically important. From a gender perspective, not accepting that you have to do it the way the boys have done it, the way the people who necessarily came in front of you did it. I'm not Daryl T. Bean. I'm never going to be Daryl T. Bean. I'm a completely different entity. I love Daryl. But I do my job very differently than Daryl T. Bean did his job. As a woman, I have a set of friends that I can check in with and ask. Talk to them about particular issues, litmus tests when I need to. When I'm uncertain from a policy perspective about something, and I can sit down with some of my very close confidants and process pros and cons of certain issues, and actually come to a place of comfort and confidence on a particular issue. And I have to say that with some of the, and this is stereotyping at its worst, with some of the guys that I work with, they just shoot from the hip. And they shoot from the hip on an ongoing basis and don't necessarily take the time to process what it means for the organization or for a local or for a group of workers. And I think that's really important to do. I think, too, that you have to be brave. And as women, we do have to be brave. We have to be able to go into the lion's den and look calm and collected. Nobody needs to know that your knees are knocking. You have to remember to breathe. You can't speak too fast. And, that's critically important, because if you are going to have people believe in your representation, in your ability to do the job, you have to make people believe that you can. And sometimes that means that you fake it. I can remember working for another union, this is a very short, funny story, where I was going to do a hearing. And I was feeling quite overwhelmed. And I said to one of the staff reps, I've got this arbitration this week, and I really feel that I'm not the best person to be doing this. I feel like I'm a big faker. Well, when I came into work, the next day on my desk was a beautifully wrapped box. And in it was a plastic blowfish. And he wrote me a little card and said, just blow yourself up, girlfriend, and go in there. And nobody's going to be none the wiser. You know what you're doing. Just go in there and do what you got to do.
That's a great story. I love it. Jean, one of the things that Janet mentioned was, and I've written about this before, about nominations and having to fight a nomination. You were one of several women who were appointed to your riding in 93 by Jean Chrétien, and he was the opposition leader at the time. A lot of controversy about that, the fact that you women just zipped into these ridings without having to face any kind of battle. Do you feel that you were less of a politician as a result of that, that you didn't have to go through, the big nomination fight for that riding, because Liberals were, Toronto is Liberal territory. So I just want to hear your thoughts about that, and if there was some criticism about that.
I know there was much criticism about that, and I had it follow me throughout the campaign. At the same time, in retrospect, that was the best thing that could have happened. It happened not only in terms of having myself in 1993 become the first African Canadian woman to get into the parliament. There would not have been that first were it not for that appointment. And I think that Minister Reid this morning kind of spoke to the fact that I was busy, I was into a corporate life and a life in education, etc. I was not in any party associations and affiliations, and so it would have been really difficult for me to have picked up a nomination in the space of time when there was a right to lifer who had been out in all the churches in the area and had sold hundreds and hundreds of memberships. And so the scale was weighed in that direction. There was no chance whatsoever that in a nomination of fair and square, get out there, sell memberships, that I would have made it. And so when Mr. Chrétien made the appointment of about, I think, 12 or more women, not just women, because people like Art Eggleton and some other people were also part of this, men and women, appointed across the country, it immediately gave me the candidacy and also the start of a campaign. It was not the ideal, because I had the question all the time in every, you're an appointed candidate, and even very strong liberals, including liberal women, whom I thought would have come and be around, were a little skittish about the fact that here was this appointed candidate. And I went on to win by pretty close to 15,000 votes. And as Donna here would tell you, I picked up all the women's votes, not only the liberal women, but also all the New Democratic women, because I was an activist. I was a school principal in the area. People knew me. I was not a name that was unknown. And then people like yourself gave me a lot of play in terms of star candidate. That didn't hurt. And so I would not be sitting here today were it not for that appointment.
And so you would be a proponent of that process still? You would be a proponent of that process still, because there's a debate. We're facing an election probably in about 3 or 4 weeks, and there's always the debate about putting women in ridings without facing that nomination battle. Are you just as good a politician?
I would support that, and I would support that in women in winnable ridings, the appointment of women in winnable ridings, because mine at the time was not identified as a winnable riding. We had a really excellent politician, someone I admired in the person of Patrick Boyer at the time. Very strong, but at the same time I was able to defeat him, and I think that the decision has to be made to support women and to have women in winnable ridings. And the whole process of whether, one is parachuted, this is another accusation that sometimes you hear leveled at women, and you hear the appointment process. I have no problems as long as there is some legitimacy which a party gives to the leader in order to do this.
Right. Okay. One of the big issues is on the Hill right now is political discourse and the sort of the viciousness, the partisanship, the kinds of words that are tossed around. And in your environments, I want to ask all four of you, and we'll start with Marie. In your environment, what is the discourse like? How do you temper it? How do you make sure that that there's a respectful dialogue? Because we hear that so much of this turns off people from voting, that Canadians are just disgusted with what they see in question period, which is sort of the main focus of politics, of government for so many Canadians. So what can you do? What can we do about it? What can we do to make sure that people get involved in the process and aren't turned off?
Are you sure you don't want to start at the other end of the... No, I should just say, because it's not clear, before I became a commissioner, I actually spent 25 years of my life with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, so I spent a lot of my time as a political observer as well. And I would say that, what I think is one of the huge challenges is remembering the value base that called one to the job in the first place. We hear phrases like, well, is it a winnable riding, or is that person electable, or I think I'm going to run because I've got a good chance to get in. And in my mind, what's always playing is, yes, but what do you want to accomplish? Is it just about getting there? I mean, what do you want to accomplish? And I think if the discourse in any political forum, whether it's on the floor of the House of Commons or even in the nominating processes, was about what is it that we want to accomplish, there would be so much more room for an engaged conversation that isn't adversarial. And I must say I greatly valued the panel this morning where we had people from different political leanings, but speaking from a common perspective of what are the particular challenges for women. And we spend so much time investing in what differentiates us and makes us different so that one has a leg up over the other, rather than what are the critical issues facing our country. I mean, one of the questions I want to ask, rhetorically to all the young women in the room is, what is it you see about our country that is broken, that needs fixing, that needs your hand in the fixing of it? What is it about our country that could be better, that can be enriched by your involvement in it? I mean, I think if we could bring the conversation to that level, then it's less pointed of right and wrong and up and down and in and out and all of that.
In and out. That's one of the scandals that we're dealing with on Parliament Hill right now. Good phrase. So there you go. Janet.
You're welcome.
A couple of things about this. First of all, democracy is supposed to be a battle of ideas. People who feel strongly about issues and feel so strongly about them that they're prepared to go out and raise money, knock on doors, run for office. And trust me, running for office is not a job for sissies or weak. I mean, like, you've got to be a tough, in many ways, to do it. It's not easy, but it's important, and you go do it. So, but you're supposed to have opinions. And one of the problems that we do have in our, I'll call it political culture, and when I say that, I'm not talking about just within Parliament Hill, I'm talking about politicians, media, all of the groups around. It's okay for two people to have different views on an issue. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing going on. It doesn't mean one of those people is bad. But part of our problem is we've got ourselves locked into boxes on so many policy issues in this country where we won't let anybody actually talk about them, because somehow or other it'll generate controversy, or somehow or other that person's view is a little outside of what I think the correct box is. And the whole system is very guilty of that. So I think that's an important message for us to understand and to appreciate. because what it drives, and because the politicians are reflecting a smaller p political culture. You see it writ large. It's more in the political environment because the stakes are higher and the TV cameras are on, and all of those things that drive it to a higher level. But it's not unique to the political class. The other thing to remember about political debate is that if you go back into Hansard's 100 years ago, those were not Tea Party discussions. I can't say Tea Party anymore either. No, that we've lost the. Those were not polite, genteel living room discussions. They were bare-knuckle brawlers back there in the good old days, standing up in their legislatures. So, again, political debate is not new. That being said, I do believe that what has happened to our political culture is that, and the previous speaker, and I'm sorry, I forget her name, but when she talked about how do politicians expect voters to treat them with respect when they don't treat each other with respect. And that everything is getting sacrificed to gaining the political point. It's terrible. It's awful. I hear people who I'm friends with, that I served in the Ontario legislature with, or I know, from all parties, and I watch some of the words that come out of their mouth, and now I'm not there, and God knows maybe I'd be doing it if I was there now. But it appalls me. I mean, I love politics. I'm interested in politics, but I hear too many of our politicians at all levels from all parties saying things that I don't care about. So I can't imagine what the voters are thinking about. So, and it's partly, it's not the politicians' fault or the media's fault, but collectively it's both of their faults. And I don't know how we break out of that box that we've got ourselves in, but if we don't want to end up with the kind of completely almost dysfunctional political culture that we see south of the border right now, we've got to step back and start thinking about the other person across that aisle as a person. They ran for office for the same reason I ran for office, or Jean ran for office, because we cared, because we thought we could make a difference, because there were issues that were important to us. And even though and listen, I was a great partisan, and I could stand up there and I could give as good as I got. And don't let anybody tell you that somehow or other women are nicer about how they play politics. I mean, I've seen women turn growing men into jelly in a political context. But that's okay as long as you remember that the other person, that you have to be able to talk to them afterwards. You have to be able to go have a drink with them afterwards. You have to be able to work with them and have enough respect for them that you can sit down in the same room and have an intelligent conversation about how to solve the problem. So I don't know how we fix it, but we have to fix it, and maybe you're the generation that can do it.
Yeah, possibly. Well, Elizabeth May, the Green Party leader this week, released her negative ad, which is an ad attacking negative ads. And she says that she wants, and actually, the production values for the Green Party, that probably doesn't have a lot of money, the production values on that ad were absolutely fantastic, and it's clever. And she said in her press conference that if she gets elected, because boy, she needs a seat in the House of Commons, because if she doesn't get one, she's done as leader. If she gets a seat in the House of Commons, she wants to try to ban heckling. So we'll see what happens with that. Good luck to Elizabeth May.
But Jane, do you think
that's half the fun?
But polite heckling.
But do you think we equate politics with leadership to our peril? Do we equate politics with news to our peril? I mean, sometimes I think we don't make a distinction, and in my mind, they're not the same thing.
No, that's a good question. Patty, take that one on, as well as I would think being in the labor movement that the House of Commons is probably a piece of cake compared to some of the conversations that go on in your union halls.
Well, we have fun. We have fun at union meetings. And there has to be room for debate and for dissent. And quite frankly, debate and dissent are critical to the evolution of organizations, to the evolution of the country. I mean, 50 years ago, who would have believed that we would have same-sex marriage? Oh my God, right? 15 years ago. So dissent and debate are critically important. I don't think personal attacks are, though. And I've certainly seen people attack politicians, leaders, personally. And as you so eloquently put it earlier on, it's about issues. It's not about people. At meetings that I go to and that I attend, we do try to keep some level of decorum, respectful debate in a room. Sometimes people can't do that. And when people can't do that, I normally try to interact with them after the meeting. I have no problem with angry people, cranky people, people who hate my guts or hate the union's guts or are against the labor movement. Let's have a discussion, but let's have a civilized discussion about the issues. And, it sort of goes back, I'm sure just about everybody in this room, their mother said to them, "Oh, you can't do that. Don't sink to that person's level." That doesn't mean you can't play in the mud, but you choose not to. You choose to treat people respectfully.
Jean, you were in government in a majority situation. This is a minority parliament, and so one of the theories is that it is just so much more aggressive and partisan because every second we're wondering if the government's going to fall, and the media plays a role in that as well. So, I want to hear your thoughts on that, because there were problems when you were there in terms of the discourse, but it just seems it's just upped a little bit more since the majority times.
I am usually appalled when I see and hear the discourse and what's happening there. And I think if Sheila, Marlene, and others who were in Parliament way before I was had an opportunity, they can talk about the times when there was some collegiality, there was some way of having a coffee together, there was some way where after the committee meeting is over that individuals from all parties could get together. And I think we've lost that. I think there's a lot of very, very partisan games that are played out, and I think some of it seemed to me come about as a result of decisions that are made not through processes, legislative processes, but decisions that are made through mandates, through statements, through decisions, and the parliamentarians seem not to have a say through the process that's laid out in constitutional frameworks, that is a frustration, and it's very difficult to operate when you are overruled, not because it is something that is part of the way in which a process takes place, but because it's the I say so, or we have the power to do this. And I think it's frustration. Many of us go in Parliament, and when I was elected, I went with a whole set of issues in my belly. And you want to make things happen, and you want to make things happen now. And at the same time, it's a team sport. And what is good for the North is not good for the South. What's good for the East is not good for the West. What's good for men, not good and things get churned around and churned around. And you do get something out of it, but not what you somehow go in expecting would be the end result. And so if you can't see the process by which things are happening, it's very, very frustrating to live and to operate within what is happening right now on the Hill.
Yeah, so the answer is a Harper majority government then. Is that what you're saying?
I wasn't going to be partisan, but if you want to say this, I'll have to rebut.
Okay, I'm just kidding. I just want to say before I open up the floor to questions, so I know there's lots of questions. I see somebody standing there. I wrote a story on Tuesday, and I think that was International Women's Day, about the fact that with the scandals that are going on in the House of Commons, Jason Kenney, the immigration minister, was up on his feet defending himself to beat the ban going on every political show after after question period, whereas Bev Oda for the last 2 weeks has been sitting behind the Prime Minister, hidden from view with Ronna Ambrose and her big sort of, curtain of hair in front of her, shielding her from the TV cameras and not allowed to answer. Now, I took a lot of flack for that, but I have to say, I do think there's a double standard on Parliament Hill. That was just one of the subtle little ways I think that's displayed. I know, and I have to say, I did take a lot of flack for that story, but it's still happening up there. Anyway, let's go to questions.
Okay. Hi, Claudette Commanda, First Nation Algonquin, and Executive Director of the First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers. Wow, that's longer than I am. Anyhow, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your experiences with the forum. My question is directed to Marie Wilson. Ms. Wilson, thank you very much for providing a brief overview on the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And it was much needed, and I'm sure that everyone in this forum truly appreciated hearing the brief overview and the mandates of the TRC. But my question, Ms. Wilson, is what do you think Canadians can do to support the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and cultivate reconciliation?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and it is the question, isn't it? It's the question we are asked every day when we go out on our job. What does reconciliation mean? And it's both a generous question and a kind of a loaded question, because I think sometimes people ask that question in hopes that there isn't really an answer that applies to them. And I sometimes say, I don't know if any of you have words when you go to type them on your computer, but you constantly spell them wrong. I have certain words, I always spell them wrong, and reconciliation is one of them. And you know what? I leave the I out of it. And I just think that's so powerful, because somehow we think reconciliation is about everybody else. And it starts with I. What can I do about that? And for many people, especially in the Aboriginal community, who want to think it's up to the rest of Canada to reconcile with them, some people are there in their thinking. In fact, for many people, it's right within their own family, where as a result of experiences at the schools, things have not gone well, either at the level of taking care of oneself and self-respect and self-regard and self-care, or at the level of family and healthy relationships, or at the level of community. A lot of times children or grandchildren have no idea. They don't know anything more about the residential schools than so-called mainstream Canada. So they don't understand why things have been or are the way they have been or are. So reconciliation can be information and educating with a small e. Reconciliation can be capital E education. It can be our schools and our universities taking responsibility, and our ministers of education to say it isn't right that we all went to school and didn't learn about this. It's not a small part of our history, it's a huge part of our history. So where is the curricula that is being not only dabbled at, but mandated as an essential part of our learning, so that we don't have one group of people learning that their culture is worth nothing, and another whole group of people also learning that their culture is worth nothing, and therefore mine must be superior. And wherever that enters into us in a kind of embedded way to think some people are more equal than others in the Canadian context. Why is it that we think we have 2 founding nations in Canada when the highest law of the land says, no, we have 3? And the last time I was in this building was when the Constitution was being patriated, and what a hard-fought battle that was to have Aboriginal rights included in the Constitution, and it was done under the leadership of Aboriginal men and women. We should be proud of that. It defines our country in a very particular way in the world. What would reconciliation look like in the context of economic reconciliation? When I talk about common values, I absolutely agree with your point about diversity and debate. I'm all for it. I grew up in a newsroom. Duking it out on a story is like part of your daily fun, and arguing for the merits of this or that story. But what I mean is we can debate the how of things, but are we still at the point where we're debating the why of things? I mean, are there some of us in the country that thinks massive poverty for a certain sector of our population is an okay thing or a good thing? And if If we all agree that no, that really isn't, then we can debate about how we address it. But surely we don't think it's actually okay. So that could be reconciliation. You know, why do we have tuberculosis outbreaks in Canada, but we only talk about it in developing countries? And why are we not tackling that as a major issue? We do when it's in other countries. Why can we not wrestle up the kind of immediate, big, fat, generous Canadian heart to address the chronic water and housing issues in Aboriginal Canada when we can do it for Haiti and many other countries of the world, and proudly, and so we should. So I think it can be all kinds of different things, and I think what we have to do is take it as new learning for those of us who are still learning about these things and say, what would that mean in my everyday living? What would that mean in my respectful relations? What would that mean about the eyes I bring to the person I might be seeing on the street and wondering, how did that person come to be there? What would it mean in terms of rapid response by police forces when women are disappearing and being murdered, and a vast majority of those are Aboriginal women, but we don't treat it as a national crisis? Reconciliation can live and breathe in all those things. And this morning the comment was made, the buzzword of reconciliation. And I know it was used in a glib way to make kind of a political joke. But I don't want it to become a political joke. You know, it should be a word of invitation and tremendous inspiration for all of us, because Canada as a whole has expressed courage in signing up for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was brought there by the courts, and we've talked about elected leadership, but there's leadership in all of our public institutions, and the more reflective all those institutions are of our entire country and all of the founding peoples of our country, the richer potential we have to live in truly respectful relations with each other and know each other, and not continue this big gulf of ignorance where we don't actually know each other very well in this shared homeland.
Thank you. Thanks, Marie. Now, I think we have a question down at the mic down there. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Vicki Smallman. I'm interested in the issue of operating in a male-dominated environment when we don't have the critical mass that is required. And this, I mean, my experience, the temptation when you're operating in that environment is to overcompensate, to work harder, you know, longer hours, take on the extra responsibilities, you know. So if you're not sort of doing the being one with the boys, going out for beers or whatever, you're just being extra, you know, more you than you possibly could be, I guess, or more effective, more, you know, more committed to prove that you're worth being there. And I just wonder, without that critical mass, is it really politics or to navigate the corridors of power on our own terms with the kind of boundaries that we need to establish to take care of ourselves and raise the issues in a way that that may allow us to make progress toward the kind of a vision that Marie was just describing. Thanks.
Okay, who wants to start? Janet?
Really good. And I've hit the right button. Really good question. And first of all, you don't need critical mass. I mean, it's important. It can make a difference. But you can affect change, and you can make things happen even if there's one of you or maybe just a couple of you. And don't think in terms of gender, and that somehow or other it's a problem because there's only 3 women around the cabinet table and, you know, 10 men. Because if you come at it that way, you're not going to be able to make the change. Go out and have a beer with the guys. You know, if that's how you're going to build the relationships that allow you to work with them. And every group, every organization, every country or company, government, political party has its own culture for how people get along within it. And women are really good at adapting to culture and using culture and making culture work for them. So go out and have a drink with the guys. Buy them a drink once in a while, or whatever to build that sort of relationship that allows you to affect change. I think that's a really, really important piece to remember about it. The other thing about it reminds me of the phrase, and I'm going to forget who said it, but you know, to be a woman or to be successful as a woman, you got to work twice as hard to be considered half as good as a man. Unfortunately, that's not hard. But most successful men, actually all successful men I know, work incredibly hard. Just as all successful women, I know, work incredibly hard. So if you want to get somewhere, if you want to accomplish something, you're going to work your butt off. And that is really, really important. And that's when you look at people who've accomplished great things, that's how they did it. They didn't go home at 5 o'clock. They found a way to make it happen. Parents, too. They found a way to make it happen. So I think it's a really good question.
Would you like to try that one? I always think it's age. I figure it's no longer gender. Now that I'm of a certain age, it's age. I'm way older than everybody else, so I can tell them what to do. Yeah.
Age. Well, I think having a critical mass would make a huge difference. Myself. I've worked as an officer of the union when there were a couple of women officers and when we were the majority of our executive committee. And it does make a difference. Or it certainly has for us organizationally. I think if we had a critical mass in Canada, we might have a national child care policy. I listened about Norway, and I was sitting there thinking, wow, I've sort of moved beyond thinking utopia, but I was thinking, wow, the gap has opened up between these two states, and there was a time when we were much closely aligned politically. I think that women do work incredibly hard. Women in leadership positions, I think, are very hard on themselves and have a great deal of difficulty in saying no or designating things to other people or trusting. If I designate this to Joe or Josephine Soap, that they're going to do the job, they're going to be accountable for the job, and they're going to do a good job. And I think that is a gendered thing that we've learned. Well, I'm going to be 50 this year, so I think this is part of what I learned as a woman, as a girl woman. And I think that that's something that we have to support young women in, that it is okay to say no. It is okay to say, I have child care responsibilities. I need to go pick up my kid at school. I need to go to my parent-teacher meeting, because we need to support each other in having lives. If we don't have lives, we can't do the work. So I think a critical mass is really helpful. I'd like to see a critical mass on the Hill. I'd like to see a critical mass in every legislative assembly. And I think that with the room full of women that we've got here, that's an achievable goal.
Jean, your thoughts?
I'd like to see a critical mass on the Hill, but I'm not too sure ideologically that a critical mass on one side would do what we would want to see happen for women in Canada. It's important that we recognize that there are some issues that as women we have to coalesce around, that we can differ on all kinds of issues, but there should be some issues that somehow we can see, not in terms of individuals, but in terms of the entire Canadian women community, and we have to work around those. I've been in rooms where we've had numbers of women where you have women who would come up with, we just have to look at some of the commentaries around International Women's Day. It was, when you read some of the women who were saying, what is this all about? And at the same time, if you have women who are in positions where they should be helping the cause, as it were, kind of denigrating, downplaying, if I can pull myself up, why can't you, attitude, then I think that, we're missing something when we talk about a critical mass.
What's more important to me, critical mass is important, and I didn't say it wasn't important, but what is more important than critical mass is women treating each other with respect. And some of the most vicious commentary I have seen in my political experience is women writing about other women who are in a different political headspace than they are. That has been the most vicious I have seen in politics. So I think as women, we have to look at ourselves too, and critical mass can be important, but there's another important piece of this. If we want the guys to treat women politicians with respect, and that includes Sarah Palin, we have to treat women politicians with respect, each other, whether we agree with them or not. And so that's, I think, a lesson for all of us as well.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions over here.
Gayla Casa Nuguyam Jenny Louie from Alert Bay, the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, as well as the Kinkum Inlet people of the river. My dad's from Square Cove. I'm actually here from Vancouver. I'm actually really new to this whole politician stuff. So my question, they're pretty easy, is like, who was your inspiration to get involved in politics? And how long is the process to get to where you guys are at? And like, what kind of schooling or work experience do you need to take to really get to know and understand about politics, and like what steps you guys needed to take? But for me personally, I've been involved in my community. I'm 25 now. I started to get involved in my community at the age of 14. And since then, I've sat on many different board of directors, youth advisories. I learned how to use my voice at a young age, and once I knew my voice was being listened to and being heard, that's when I really started to make change for my people, for the First Nations community in Vancouver. And from there, I was able to sit on a provincial Aboriginal Youth Council, and I'm aged out now because I'm a quarter of a century. So it's time for me to step it up a level, and I just want to see what I could do, because I just love making change for my people, as well as just making positive changes, and I just want to hear.
Okay, good for you. It sounds like you're on the right track. Particularly if
I'm sure Jean and I could find a riding for you very, very, very quickly. First of all, there's no magic age. Some people get elected in their 20s, some people get elected in their 70s. But what I would advise people to do is do get some life and career experience before you go into politics, for three reasons. One, you need to develop the networks of people, because that's how you get into politics. You go to every friend you ever had, every contact colleague you ever had, and said, come vote for me, come knock on the door, buy a membership, give me money. So that takes some time to build up. So that's one reason. Secondly, you need to build your own skill set, which is doing exactly what you're doing. Go out and get yourself elected to something. Go run something. And because those are skills that it's much better to have them before you get elected than to try to learn them when you're in the full glare of being an elected official. And the third reason you need a little bit of life and career experience before you walk into politics is it's a very dangerous profession that can eat away at who you are. And I think Marie talked about values. You have to know who you are, what you're about, what drives you, what motivates you, and you have to know that every morning you're the only one that's looking at that face in the mirror, and you don't ever want to sacrifice the comfort you have, that you can face that face every morning. And that takes a little bit of life to just find out who you are and what you're all about and what motivates you. But once you've and that can happen at 20, that can happen at 80, but whenever that magical time happens, go for it.
Jean, do you have any advice?
I think that she's well on the way. One of the things, she's been building the network, she's been volunteering, she's been active, and I think this is really the prerequisites, if there are prerequisites. But different people start at different points. And as a young woman, I would say just continue to do what you're doing. And if that is the way that you want to spend your service life, then you find a riding. Get out there.
Okay. Absolutely.
Coming from BC, you should know that there's a campaign school, a nonpartisan campaign school for candidates who decide to present for City Council and for the Legislative Assembly in BC. It's a great school. It's normally offered at Simon Fraser University in the summertime. It's done probably every second or third year. If you're interested, you could contact the BC Federation of Labour, who would know about it. I believe they're one of many, many sponsors, but to be clear, it's not a labour school. It's a political school. If you are a union member at the Canadian Labour Congress, they also have leadership training and campaign schools at the Winter School, which are great things to access as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Could I just add one really quick point? And I don't respond to you having been elected, because I've never been in an elected office. But what I wanted to say to you is that I did spend many years in public broadcasting, and because I believe very, very strongly about the role of free press, free voice, free media in the health of democracy. And I think for anyone running for office, one of the things that people maybe skip over until they're in trouble is realizing the importance, too, of understanding how the media works, what the media needs, and what you have to give the media. So what do you have to offer? Because I think if the media is seen as the enemy, it paints you into a corner you don't want to be in. If the media is seen as the extension of your own voice in a way that doesn't compromise the media but helps you as well, then it's good for everybody, and it's good for the public service you're trying to provide.
Okay, we've got to move things along here. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I see that there's a gentleman over there who'd like to ask a question. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. Really quick question. My name is Glenn, by the way, and I live in Montreal. First is how I came here today, and then a question about decorum and the tone of our political discourse, which you talked about there for a second. I'm a new supporter of Equal Voice. I just came across the organization a couple months ago. I went to the House of Commons and followed question period for the first time in the fall. And it was only through sitting there and looking around at our elected representatives, and it was bald head, gray hair, man. And it really was an aha moment for me, in the sense that this is not reflective of Canada. This isn't reflective of our demographics. Visual minorities weren't represented, women weren't represented, and when we watched, that 5-second soundbite at the end of on the CBC News at the night, and you've got the leader, and there seems to be representation behind them. That's a visual reinforcement. All is well. And we can put out these numbers that women are underrepresented, but that visual reinforcement stays with you. And it was only when I got that panned out vision of that, no, that's not all well, that I looked up Equal Voice and found out the work that you're doing. So all the more power to the work that you're doing. The question about the tone of politics, Equal Voice came out with a slogan back in the fall because there's a motion going through about how to fix question period. And the slogan was rough but not tough. And I thought that was it kind of plays the discussion about where's that balance between, it's not a knitting group, but it's also somewhere where we have to respect each other and be civil. And there's also a bit of a sexual innuendo, I think, but I'm not too sure. So the question that I have, is about respect, and the person from Norway alluded to it as well. If we don't respect politicians, and when you survey Canadians and you say, in terms of who you respect, doctors, yada yada, politicians and car salesmen are right there at the bottom. And so how do we as young Canadians want to aspire to run for that office, or to aspire other young women or whoever to run for that office, if the position itself isn't respected? And so my question is, what tangible steps do you think can be taken to address the decorum and the tone of our political discourse?
Okay, thank you. I don't know who wants to take it, but I think journalists are right at the top above the doctors. So go ahead.
I hate to tell you this. You're right down there with us politicians, Jane. I hate to tell you that.
I was trying to say it's exaggerated.
I guess the first thing I would say is that as an individual who let's say is any of us who decide to run for office, or those who've been in for office or whatever, you may not be able to change the system you're in, but what you can do is be different. You can be the politician who actually accomplishes and does what you say you're going to do. You can be the politician that actually is not afraid to sit down with people of opposing views, not afraid to reach across the aisle and work with another, politician from a different political stripe. And that takes, I'll tell you, in some ridings, on some issues, that takes guts to do. And if enough of us were to make that commitment that we'll change, we will be good, we will do what we want politicians to do, that might make a major, major difference.
Thank you. Let's go over here now.
Hello. My name is Rochelle Van. I'm coming from Alberta. I represent an organization that has 14 chapters in Alberta for Aboriginal women. I just wanted to ask a question because there has been some talk about the dissension among women, and our organization does a lot to support other women, and feel it's really necessary even for consultation. So just this gathering is a very good example of sharing some of the experiences of the Aboriginal community to other people who may not be aware and those who are going into politics. But one of the questions is, what can you do to make sure that you are getting the views of the Aboriginal women as politicians or in the communities or the positions that you're in? What do you do currently and what could you be doing?
Okay. Patty, do you want to start?
Actually, today I left a meeting of our planning committee for our National Aboriginal Peoples Conference to come and sit on the panel. So I'm currently meeting with Aboriginal members from all across Canada, getting ready for our next national conference in Yellowknife. We have a National Aboriginal Peoples Circle that has representatives from all across Canada sitting on it, that actually advises the union on an ongoing basis related to policy. And we have a human rights structure that likewise provides us input with respect to cross-organizational issues of human rights. And we consult. We try to consult perfectly, of course, but oftentimes we're consulting with our membership on the fly. But on an ongoing basis, we're communicating with our members in order to make sure that decisions that we're making, if they're particular to Aboriginal members, with the Aboriginal community, if it's a broader human rights issue, to make sure from a cross-organizational perspective we're doing that work. And a good example of the work that our last meeting that we actually had, the Senate committee was having their hearings on Bill C-3. Sharon McIver was in giving evidence related to the ongoing gender-based discrimination in the Indian Act, and we were able to go with our 20 members from our National Aboriginal Circle to make sure that they understand how government and parliamentary processes work, and two, to give our support to Sharon McIver in ensuring that gender-based discrimination is eliminated from the Indian Act.
Jean, any thoughts on how you include and make sure those issues are heard in your organization?
I think it's important for us in any policy discussion to be as inclusive, to recognize diversity, to recognize the history and of our country, and to recognize the responsibilities that we have as political leaders, as policy makers, to include all of those issues that are that concern not just the Aboriginal people. I know that there are platforms and fora and other places where the issues are unidimensionally addressed, but I think we have to see this crossing as a cross-cutting issue, as it were, in any policy discussion, in any decision making, in any way in which in the society we move things forward. Because I think to ignore one major part of our population is really not to be the Canada that we all want and value.
Just a practical suggestion, if you will, for those who are interested in running for office. The most successful politicians I know have sort of kitchen cabinets of various kinds. So they'll have people who are sort of personal support. For example, I had one of the group that I used to use for advice, and when you got in trouble, sometimes they're the only friends you have, so you need to pick them wisely. Somebody who just didn't agree with me on anything philosophically. Like, she was just so far off the spectrum, and it was great. I mean, it was really good. So you need to pick diverse opinions. And the second thing, on policy issues, you need to have people that if you need, for example, if you're going to an all-candidates debate or you are a minister or whatever, you need to have people you can pick up the phone and call who are going to give you a quick 5-minute synopsis on the issue. So maybe it's an Aboriginal leader and something's coming up and you pick up the phone and call them. Maybe it's a Bay Street banker. Maybe it's a healthcare worker. But you need to have people that you can go to give you quick advice and insight on what's really happening on the ground in their particular sector.
We've got two more.
One thing that I want to underscore, and that is the whole issue of the kitchen cabinet. I thought that was just mine. But it's a few people who are not within the entire political whatever. Those are just people that, in common parlance, you can say, watch your back, as it were, and who would speak truth to you at all times, regardless of the position and the conditions under which you have to make your decision.
Very good. Two more questions. We're about 1 minute left, so we'll go quickly. Over here.
Hi, sorry, I'm reflecting a lot on everything that you all have said here and also what was discussed this morning in terms of just a lot of the advice and insights that you've given in terms of the things that you can draw on within yourselves, that you can control in your own lives to be able to take on quite a bit of challenges from multiple angles. And I'm wondering, reflecting on some of the questions that were posed this morning about are women framed to fail or something like that, and are there systems or maybe externalities which helped you personally that maybe weren't out of your control? Because I think some of the interesting things you've said today really draw on your personal individual experiences, and I wondered if there were things in your lives that if you had to pick one thing, you're like, I'm really happy that ally stepped in, or this particular opportunity presented itself to me because someone else was able to step in at a particular time. And as a speculative question, I wonder what you think the odds are of a cross-party women's caucus in the House.
Okay, well, 30 seconds.
In the current House of Commons, unlikely for a while. First of all, I could name a gazillion times in my political life where someone helped me, someone gave me an opportunity. Too many times to mention. So again, networking, relationships, a broad network, because you need everybody to give you every break you can as you go up, and you need to give everybody a break too as you go along. I think that's a really, really important thing to do. The other point I can't remember what it was. This is what happens when you get older. So I'll let my colleagues make a comment.
I had an amazing mother. I had a mom that worked my whole life, even though when I was a kid nobody else's mom worked. And she worked hard, and she was a kick-ass mom. And she taught me that I could do anything I put my mind to, and that I could be anyone, do anything, go anywhere, and that the world was my oyster, and there were no barriers. And if I said to her I was afraid to do anything. I can remember being in Mexico and being afraid of parasailing. And the day before we left, she said, you've got to do that. I haven't seen you afraid of doing anything in a really long time. And she taught me those lessons, and at 81, she's non-traditional and going strong to this very day.
I would point to my mother too and my father, but I was really listening to what Nancy said this morning. My parents were ones who, they were not well off at all, quite poor actually, but they always stressed no matter what you have to have something to share. And they were constantly involved in service. And I know I learned that value from them. But they were also, and maybe I have 3 brothers, I was the only girl, so in some ways you'd think I would be more tied to home, but they were completely respectful of me, even dreams that made no practical sense to them in any way, because they were so far outside of their own experience. So for example, I went away and lived and worked in Africa for 2 years when I was in my early 20s. And that might not sound like such a big deal, except that it was before you could afford such a long-distance phone call, and I had no phone, and there was no fax, and there was no cell phone, and there wasn't even telex. There was nothing. I didn't literally hear the voice of anyone from my family for 2 years. I think about that today, and I think I would kill my kids if they did that, you know. But I realized they were so respectful of me, and in a way, the lesson is this. I learned from my mother to both feel confident in myself, but look up to my children. To not leave it entirely for my children to look up to me, but also to look up to my children and to give them that, so that you're living your own calling at the same time as you are investing in theirs. And that's how I try to be.
Very nice. Okay, last question over here, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Thank you very much. My name is Megan Coker, and I'm involved in student government. So in the work that I do, I'm often working with university students that are developing as leaders. So when you have young females that are trying to develop themselves, questions are often asked, what type of leader do I want to be? And what style of leadership do I want to try to employ? And I think that when we look traditionally as to within government or within business, what has been recognized as being the most powerful and most effective is a dominant style type of leadership that sometimes requires aggressiveness. And I think that we've seen that men naturally tend towards excelling in that area, and some women are reluctant to be able to take that approach. And if they have taken an aggressive approach, sometimes they get slammed for it. Now, I think that when we're looking towards what's being most effective, it's sometimes a balance between being collaborative and then also being pointed in what you want. What suggestions would you have for young leaders that are trying to define their style of leadership? What should they be striving for? And also, considering the system that we're in, when you recognize, oh, that is a strong leader, usually that person employs some of these dominant, aggressive traits. What can we do to try to encourage the system to try to recognize other styles of leadership that can be just as effective or more?
I think one of the important things is that to have an adaptable style of leadership. First of all, whatever you're doing, you must treat people with respect, and you must know where you want to go, and you must, and be prepared to work hard and whatever to get there. But different kinds of leadership are what you need to be able to have, because there's leadership from beside, there's leadership from below, and there's leadership from above. And you need to be able to influence people from all of those positions, and they're all unique ways to come at it. The other thing about different leadership styles, we are rarely in a position where we have so much power that we can be total SOBs and people have to follow us. That is a particular leadership style. You have, again, respect, and you want to be able to motivate people to come with you, to do what you want them to do, to follow you in whatever cause. So perhaps respect and motivation, be able to motivate people, and adaptable leadership styles, wherever you are in the hierarchy, would be, I think, would be really, really important to learn.
Well, first of all, I would take issue with your opening comment, which is that it has been the most dominant and effective, you said, if I heard you correctly. And I would say it has been the most predominant, but not necessarily the most effective. And compared to what? I think we have to find lots of models to compare to, including, as Aboriginal peoples would say, lots of traditional models of government that have survived for a long, long time and kept people alive in really dire circumstances. But I will speak not from the point of view of elected leadership, but organizational leadership, because I think a lot of the same things apply. I completely agree with the point made first and foremost to know what it is you're trying to achieve, what it is you're trying to do. And from there, I think respect is key. And the other thing I would say is humility. To know that really it's only going to really work to best effect when you are finding a way to lift each other up and to bring out the best in each other. And that means don't get parked on the place that you think you have to have all the answers. So it takes a lot of humility and a respect for all that everybody else can bring to it, and then the overall result will be better. And it's also fulfilling that way. And I say this because I'll tell you one of the most valued accolades I ever received in my leadership roles in both the CBC and in territorial government positions in the past was women leaders, when I left, saying, "You believed in me more than I believed in myself. You could see things I was capable of that I couldn't see for myself." And that is receiving their gift at the same time as giving it back to them, and it makes the whole thing just so much better. And that's what I think you need to try for.
Okay. Patty, quickly, and I think we're going to have to wrap after that.
I think we've all said you have to do the work, you have to be adaptable. I think I'm a great voyeur in meetings that I'm not chairing. I love sitting and watching people chair and facilitate meetings, because every leader has a different leadership style, a different way of chairing. And I find that I learn every time I go to a meeting with a new leader. Don't be afraid to ask people questions about why they did certain things at certain junctures in meetings, or how did you strategically plan to get the result that you were looking to get. And you know, as a woman, and as a woman who had women in front of me giving me a hand up, I've tried to make sure that I give my hand to other women in the trade union movement, to make sure that they have opportunities to test their feet, to get out there and do the work, to assume leadership positions. And I think that to develop women's leadership, that's a critical element, not just in the trade union movement, but in every political structure that we have.
I want to thank you for joining us today and for this great discussion. Marie Wilson, Janet Ecker, and of course Patty DuCharme. Thank you very much. It was just a terrific discussion. Really appreciate it.